Okay, so now it's time for us to move from what the Internet of Things is, we're talking about, to start exploring what the legal considerations are. And how we're going to do that is we're going to start by just having a look at what the IoT Alliance Australia, which is the self-described peak industry body, says that the issues are. Now, why is this important? Because you're business and law students. And so when we're thinking about the legal considerations, we've got a twofold approach here. What we're doing is we're looking at, well, what laws apply, but also what is it that business is trying to achieve using these systems and devices, and what does that mean for the way that people transact with each other, and what legal considerations do we need to take into account. Now, the IoT Alliance Australia is a lobbying body. It describes itself as the peak industry body, and its vision is to accelerate the adoption of IoT in Australia to improve competitive advantage and benefit society. I find that kind of interesting. I think if our ambition is to improve society, we shouldn't necessarily embed into it how we're going to do that. But there's my commentary for you. And the focus that that body has is to provide sound, evidence-based advocacy into policy. And so one of the things that it, in its most recent published report, which goes back to 2018-19, it actually is looking at some World Economic Forum data and saying, actually, Australia's got a way to go when it comes to key indicators for Internet of Things, and that there are missed opportunities, for want of another word, for what it is that Australia could be doing in that space. Okay, interesting. So that takes me then to a more recent World Economic Forum report. I did, when I was looking at what that body had to say, go to the original report, but there is more recent data. The QR code and the link on the slide will take you to that more recent report. It's absolutely not required reading, but it is interesting reading. And so from a policy perspective, the World Economic Forum has picked up these key issues. From a policy and a regulation point of view, they say, and I think that we can all see this, is that policy tends to lag behind quickly developing uses for technology. That it is very difficult for policymakers to see how it is that technologies might be used early on in the process when they're deciding to regulate. But there are some key issues that come up. Now, privacy is clearly one of them. So when the World Economic Forum is looking at policy, they're also looking at design practices, standards and guidelines, and recommending that privacy by design, rather than reacting to breaches, but actually designing devices to ensure that they are secure, and to embedding best practice in relation to ethical use of these devices from the very beginning should be a mandatory requirement. So this brings us back to what we were talking about last week, and when I introduced you to Lawrence Lessig's Code is Law. So effectively, the World Economic Forum is recommending that policymakers require that before devices can be approved for release, that they embed appropriate security controls and other ethical requirements, whatever those might be at this stage. So there's something for us to mull over, I think. The World Economic Forum also identify some key risks around literacy. Now, I think that this is a particularly important point to make, and one of your readings refers to the under-regulation for consumers of Internet of Things devices. And effectively, it's showing through the research that those researchers undertook that while people theoretically consent to their data being used, in reality, they really don't have very much choice. They don't necessarily understand what it is that they're consenting to. And even if they do have access to the terms and conditions, they tend not to read them. And when I say they don't understand, I don't mean that people are stupid by any sense of the imagination. What I mean here is that we don't always contemplate the ways that our data can be used, particularly when we think about big data and the way that big data algorithms can be used to take data and take information from various sources, amalgamate it, and then make predictions about what it is that we might want to buy, or how we might vote, or what kind of reactions we might have to particular news stories, etc. And that's something that we'll continue to explore this week as we move into the big data topic as well. The other key issue, I should say, is transparency, which really is a run-on from what I was just saying a second ago, that we don't necessarily understand what the possibilities are with our data, and we certainly don't understand how that data is being used. Other issues that arise in this report include safeguarding against bias. That's something that I really want to talk about in the big data section, and general security issues. So the extent to which the devices can be hacked, and that as a consequence, people can extract anything from information about us, but also money and access to our financial records, etc. And we'll talk about a number of these things as we progress through the different topics. Another interesting thing that I've pulled out of that report, which is on the slide in front of you, is some data that the World Economic Forum gathered about the extent to which users are confident that connected devices and related technologies can be protected against unethical and irresponsible uses of the technology. You'll see only about 1% are confident, and 17% are somewhat confident, where 51% are not too confident at all, and 31% have no confidence. So from a business perspective, it's clear to me that those companies and entities that want to roll out or utilize Internet of Things devices, they need to be able to address that lack of confidence, particularly amongst their customers. And that raises a legal consideration about what kind of legal protections customers should have, and what that means for customers when it comes to putting together contracts, what it means for the businesses who set the terms of those contracts, and for the customers enforcing those contracts. And so again, the reading that you have about consumer regulation, or the under-regulation, is a really good starting point for exploring that kind of issue. I'm going to ask you, whether you're looking on the video or otherwise, to take a look at the table that's on this slide on the PowerPoint, rather than try and look at it on the video, because it's just got way too much information in it. But it is a nice little summary, and I think I'll put it on the canvas as well so you can find it there, of the range of different types of laws that are regulating the use of users' data by business and organisations around the world. Now, these are really focusing on laws that we would refer to in Australia as privacy laws. So there are so many different ways of protecting personal information, and corporations in particular, multinational corporations, need to be able to understand what laws apply to the way that they roll out those materials. Some governments have faced challenges in enforcing this legislation due to the difficulties of integrating the requirements across systems. and having vendors agree to comply and adapt with the regulatory or judicial clarifications. And so, as a consequence, as businesses develop these technologies, remembering that very few businesses do everything, the software and the hardware are quite often developed by completely different entities that then a brand will consolidate, package, distribute, and market. So we've got a number of different players in the presentation of an Internet of Things type device. And so all of those entities need to come together to address the regulatory requirements if the ultimate device is going to be used in a particular place. One of the most important elements of thinking about these kind of laws will be the first listed on this table, the GDPR. That's the General Data Protection Regulation of the European Union. Now, this is a significantly far-reaching law, and it applies in relation to any data held in relation to European citizens. So its reach is absolutely extensive. Its jurisdictional reach is extensive. And what we've seen worldwide, and I'm pretty sure I mentioned this in last week's lecture, is that ultimately technology companies have adopted this as the highest standard, and have tended to work within the requirements of this law rather than trying to fight against it. So as the slide says, it's considered to be the world's strongest set of data protection rules, and it set the foundation of legislation to enhance how people can access information about themselves, while also establishing limits on what businesses and organizations can do with personal data. More than 400 million people have been covered and protected under this legal framework since it first came into being. Okay, so what's the situation in Australia? Australia's equivalent of the GDPR, though quite different from the GDPR in terms of both scope and jurisdictional reach, is the Australian privacy law. The QR code that you can see on the screen will take you to the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner, which sets out the 13 Australian privacy principles which those companies that are subject to the Privacy Act need to comply with. Now, it's important to recognise that not everybody needs to comply with the Australian privacy laws. It only extends to companies that have a turnover greater than $3 million. Another quick comment I want to make about the Australian privacy law is that even if the APPs apply and the company that is issuing, distributing, selling, collecting the data from an Internet of Things device is required to share a privacy policy, the status under Australian law of that policy is not clear. It is not clear whether or not there's a contract, and it is absolutely not clear who can enforce it if it is a contract. And the Harkin reading that you've been asked to have a look at explores this idea in some more detail. The last point I want to make here in relation to privacy law is consumer Internet of Things devices collect information that is of its nature highly personalised and individualised, and it's difficult to depersonalise or de-identify. However, under the Privacy Act, determinations about whether a person is identified or reasonably identifiable from this kind of sensitive information is made on a case-by-case basis. So consumers and users of Internet of Things devices end up with uncertain protections because there's a compliance-based, individualised self-management model of privacy. So Harkin talks about the ways that if they decline to accept the terms and conditions presented to them, then they won't be able to get the services. And this by itself creates this kind of virtuous loop where even where there is a transparency around the use of that data, that there's really a lack of connection by the end user to that data. So Harkin basically argues that consumer Internet of Things is underregulated. Now, in addition to privacy issues, Harkin also looks at how the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, the ACCC, and the consumer law applies. And I think that this is also really an important factor, particularly for business people thinking about how these devices might be used or interacted with. The paper looks at these three dimensions of use. So we've got a breadth of user base that is expanding, not just the people who buy or own or know they're interacting with an Internet of Things device. We've got increasing volume and types of data collected and increasing diversity of uses for Internet of Things devices. And as a consequence, there's a whole number of legal, ethical, and regulatory dilemmas around the security, privacy, and consent when it comes to the use of these devices. And Harkin ultimately concludes that because there's no clarity around what the regulation priorities should be, that a lot of future work needs to be done very, very quickly. So what kind of legal considerations for IoT are we going to focus on? I've already spoken a bit about privacy and consent. I probably have a little bit more to say about consent, and along with consumer protection. Both of these are dealt with in the Harkin article and I think are really important. Product liability is something we're going to come back to over and over again, and we'll talk about that a lot when we talk about autonomous vehicles. But I do want to raise it here as well, that question of who's responsible if something goes wrong. Who's responsible if, say, for example, I'm relying on my Internet of Things smartwatch to tell me if I'm having a heart attack or to notify somebody else if I've had a fall and I need rescuing. This intellectual property issues that we'll get to as well, particularly as the waters are very muddy as to who owns data and who owns the product of that data. Property laws more generally, not just intellectual property, will fall into place. So when I talk about property laws, I'm not necessarily talking about physical, real property, but talking about the question of ownership. And we keep coming back to this idea of security and vulnerability. Whose responsibility is it to ensure that Internet of Things devices are secure and not subject to vulnerabilities? Whose responsibility is it to ensure that data doesn't get used for inappropriate purposes? A couple of things I'd really like to point out is this idea of consent. So the model that Australia uses, and it's a model you'll see back from the slide with the World Economic Forum data that's used worldwide, is that your data is private unless you consent to it being used. But when we're talking about Internet of Things devices, we're talking about many opportunities for users and the owners, the source of the data that's being connected, to not having capacity or even opportunity to consent. So a domestic Internet of Things device, for example, might be used in a household where many members of the same household who weren't engaged in the consent process are providing data to that device or thing. And when a principal user, so the owner, the person who bought the device, consents on behalf of another individual, that can be really concerning, as it's unlikely that the individual in question actually knows or can consent to the information being sent. Of course, escalating adoption of consumer Internet of Things devices is going to have positive and negative impacts on a range of different communities, including those with disabilities, the elderly, and children. And there's a growing amount of research that identifies the ways in which Internet of Things can be used to aid abuse, stalk, and harass, but also to protect and to improve the health and well-being of vulnerable people. So the next thing that I want to raise that Harkin and others talk about in the article that you've asked me to read in some detail is the concerns that if we set the standard too high, that it will be very difficult and expensive for smart startup companies, smart people in startup companies, to meet the standards required. That the cost of building privacy by design into the devices and otherwise meeting standards that address these legal and ethical issues that we've been toying with so far could in fact be prohibitive and be a barrier that would stop innovation and stop disruptors coming up and finding new uses and new ways to benefit society with these new technologies. So a number of people in the study, in the interviews that Harkin did, suggested that small-scale companies don't have the resources, the capacity or inclination to focus on that high-quality production, and they'll only do the barest minimum that they're required to do. Be really interested to hear what your thoughts are in relation to this. And ultimately, we've got to think about, as business people, what's going to be important to ensuring the sustainability and desirability of the products and services that we deliver. So this slide here, again, it's going to be very difficult for you to read it. I'll give it a shot and put it on the screen. For those of you who were listening on a podcast, you might want to look at the slide that says the quote difference with IoT is that some of it is stunningly intrusive, end quote. What I've just tried to put on this slide is a really high-level overview of some of the most important points from Harkin's paper. I've also said out there, and it might be useful to have beside you when you're reading the paper, some of the key acronyms that are used in that paper. I think this is a really valuable read, and it will really inspire some great discussion and some good thoughts for us when we're in our workshop. Ultimately, it's going to come down to a question of values as to whether or not you think that regulation is going to be the source of an answer to these kind of problems, or whether industry itself will need to take the lead, or whether there's going to be a balance of the two. I think it's really interesting to think about Lawrence Lessig, I should say, and Coder's law in the context of Internet of Things devices in particular. There's a couple of video explainers on the canvas that I think you'll find really useful and helpful. So I would strongly recommend that you have a look at those. And then the next thing that we'll be doing together is talking about big data, what it is, and then leading into some of the legal considerations there. You might have actually listened to the big data ones first. I don't think it really matters. They're very related to each other, and many of the legal considerations for big data are exactly the same as for Internet of Things. We'll talk in the next video, but in the meantime, questions, concerns, frustrations, or compliments, you know where to find me. Cheers.